Now, we start this hour with the government's long-awaited clampdown on extremism. And Michael Gove has named 5 groups, including 3 Muslim organisations, that would be investigated over extremism fears. And I'm joined in our Westminster studio by our political editor, Chris Hope, and also by Tom Wilson, who's the Director of Policy at the Counter-Extremism Group. Good afternoon to both of you, gents. Let's start with you, Chris. So, since Rishi Sunak gave that emergency address on the steps of Downing Street, you were there, of course. It broke during my show. The far right was thrown out there as something we should be concerned about. At that time, we were saying, OK, so let's quantify that. How big is the threat? Who is the threat at? And likewise with the Islamist threat. We got a bit more detail today. 5 groups were named. Not the full shebang. That will come in a few weeks' time.
The full shebang is where I think you'll find the controversy. So he named 2 far-right groups in the House of Commons today, Patriotic Alternative and the British National Socialist Movement. 3 others named on the Islamist side, or the left of the side, he would describe it. The Muslim Association of Britain, Cage and Men. Now, he was saying none of those not called extremists at this stage, have been looked at by under this new guidelines from the Michael Gove set out today in House of Commons. And it may be they are called extremists in the future, in 3 weeks, and other groups may be tied into that. What the idea here is they're trying to strangle the funding for groups that they feel shouldn't get public money. So once you're called an extremist in one of those groups, you can't then get central government money, and that may then have a bearing on whether you get charity money, because any trustees will look at that. Well, if they say the government says you're extremist, we can't give you money. So trustees will govern it themselves. Some of these groups have received charitable funds in the past. It's an attempt to build on what, as you say, the PM Rishi Sunak said about the extremism is tearing this country apart, and they're trying to say it's from both sides. But recently we have seen more issues with the Islamist side because of the issues on October 7th, the attack on Israel.
OK, well, let's go now to Tom. Tom Wilson, 5 groups were thrown out there today, and I was surprised by the fact the British National Socialist Movement hasn't even existed since the 1960s. It was disbanded, and Patriotic Alternative, I think the biggest crime they've been guilty of is one of their members was jailed for racist stickers a couple of weeks ago. On the other end of the spectrum, some rather serious stuff from Cage, the Muslim Association of Britain, and also Muslim Engagement and Discipline. What can you tell us about those 3 groups?
Well, I think that the groups that were being talked about today and the whole subject of this new definition, what they want to focus on, is to do with much more people who are in the non-violent space. And there's clearly a threat to this country and our democracy from a couple of different angles. There's the terrorist threat, and then there's the threat of people intimidating MPs, intimidating journalists, turning up outside schools and demonstrating because they don't agree with what a teacher is teaching. And that clearly infringes on people's civil liberties and their free speech. So this new initiative is primarily trying to deal with that. Something like Prevent would deal more with the threat from terrorism and violence.
OK. I think it's really important that we try and establish a relative threat or a hierarchy, at least if we can, in terms of this. We've seen a huge boom in anti-Semitic crimes since October the 7th. That's clearly linked to the Islamist spectrum, that's fair to say, isn't it? In terms of the far right, how big a threat is it? I mean, and what about the far left? What about anarchist groups? This is a complex group of people who pose a threat.
Absolutely. So if you're talking about terrorism, and we actually look at the number of attacks that have happened from the far right, or the number of people who've been killed in far right attacks, the threat is comparatively really quite small compared to the Islamist threat, which is the main terrorist threat facing this country. And there's also a very small far left terrorist threat. But if we're talking about extremist groups, as I think we're now looking at today particularly, then yes, you do need to broaden out particularly to the far left. You mentioned October the 7th. It is Islamist groups who are very prominent in much of the activities, and we've seen extremists preaching in mosques, for instance. But the far left has also had a part in this as well, intimidating MPs, making MPs feel unsafe. GB News reporters, I believe, down at some of the protests were being intimidated.
Catherine Forster got it, yeah.
So groups that cause vandalism, mass disruption are much closer to the anarchist end of the spectrum, and hopefully a definition like this would also look at those groups too.
And when we can't... Chris,
I can say it's worth hearing what Michael Gove had to say about that very point earlier.
Precisely.
The United Kingdom is a success story. A multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy, stronger because of our diversity. But our democracy and our values of inclusivity and tolerance are under challenge.
And why don't we quickly look at what Sir Keir Starmer had to say, his reaction to today's announcements earlier.
I think the debate about extremism has to be taken very, very seriously because there hasn't really been a review of extremism now for a number of years. There are new threats, and it is important, therefore, that we all come together to look at the question of extremism and what action is now needed. What I would say is that this will only work if it is truly cross-party and not divisive. And that's the spirit in which I want to enter this discussion in relation to extremism.
And Tom Wilson, what's been extraordinary about the intimidation towards the political class since October the 7th is that the hard left have also been going for the Labour Party. We've seen Angela Rayner harass Sir Keir Starmer himself, chase off a train in Scotland, Rachel Reeves, Annalise Dodds. You know, there have been barracks outside of Labour Party MPs in London from the hard left. So it's not just a simple case of left wing and right wing. Everybody seems to be getting caught in the crossfire.
Well, I think that the far left hoped that it was going to have control of the Labour Party, and there's been a significant push to wrestle the extreme far left elements, particularly around the issue of anti-Semitism, out of Labour. And so clearly they're targeting the party once again. I think what I would pick up on what was said there by the leader of the opposition about whether there'd been anyone looking into extremism recently. Well, we did have William Shawcross's review into Prevent. And although that was about counter-terrorism, he found that government money was going to extremist groups, and he looked at the extremist threat as well as part of that. Money that was supposed to help counter extremism was actually going to people who were extremists, and the police were found to be consulting with extremists as well, which underlies the importance of having a better understanding within government of how you define who is an extremist and who isn't.
And in terms of those problematic groups, which parts of the political spectrum were they from?
That was being engaged with. Well, that's very interesting. They were exclusively, to my knowledge, Islamist. And what's really interesting is that on the question of engagement and funding, although we are hearing about the far right, to my knowledge, the government and the police, the public sector schools, they don't ever engage with the far right, rightly so. They don't fund the far right. The problem around engagement is usually starting with interfaith and attempts at community policing or counter-extremism when they end up engaging with the wrong people. Because whereas people on the far right, and far right symbolism, swastikas are very recognisable to people, I think there's an ignorance and lack of understanding about the nature of the Islamist terrorist threat.
And what's really fascinating about the groups that have been identified today from the Islamist end of the spectrum, Tom, is that the Muslim Engagement and Discipline, MEND, they've been called by the Henry Jackson Foundation Islamists masquerading as civil libertarians. Start off by trying to shine a light on Islamophobia and ended up actually hosting hate preachers, incitement to violence, sympathy for convicted terrorists. Cage started out as a sympathy group for prisoners in Guantanamo Bay and ended up hosting Al-Qaeda recruiters at conferences in Britain.
So this issue of Islamophobia that you pick up on is one that was also in the Shawcross review of Prevent, because he clearly took a very strong stand against anti-Muslim hatred, but he warned that the fear of people being labelled Islamophobic by campaign groups meant that they were nervous around looking at the issue of Islamist extremism. And I think that raises a question about whether some of the mistakes that have been made in schemes like Prevent and in the public sector is because people are nervous about making a mistake. We know that the security guard in the Manchester Arena case was nervous about approaching the bomber because he saw him praying with a large bag, and he was concerned about how that might look. So this is something that a concern has been raised about whether it's creating a certain timidity about dealing with this issue.
And Tom, do you hope that today's intervention by Michael Gove and the body of work we're about to see coming forward will end this fear of grasping the nettle and just calling these organisations out for what they are? They're activists masquerading as good guys in many senses, but we've already heard that several of them might contest this in the courts and deny the fact they're extremists. This could drag on and on.
Well, what the government has provided, as well as a definition, is a set of clear behaviours that demonstrates what people actually do that crosses that threshold into extremism. So it's not just a theoretical or philosophical argument about how to define a word. This is going to provide, hopefully, people in government, people in schools, in police, in local councils who have to make decisions about who they engage with and who they fund, a clear set of criteria by how they can decide whether or not people shouldn't be getting public money. Because I don't think the taxpayer expects to see money that goes towards countering extremism going to extremists.
Precisely. That is a huge point. You know, we are a very divided, very nervous society at the moment, post-October 7th. The very fact that public money might be going into the coffers of those who are actually trying to divide us, Tom, is grotesque.
The government for a long time has said it's going to make sure that that doesn't happen any longer. I think also the question about who is consulted with and who advises the government and the police is key. We saw when there were calls for jihad at one of these rallies following October the 7th, that the police were sort of ambiguous, really, about whether this was a problem, whether they were going to crack down on this in any way. And that goes to show how the influence sometimes of people who are themselves extremists can make the public sector confused and nervous about this issue.
Just one question, Tom. Do you worry that a future government could use this new definition to try and crack down on critical voices who aren't really extremists? I mean, that's a concern from some campaigners today.
So the nature of what's been proposed, as I understand it, would only stop funding and engagement. This doesn't criminalise anyone. It shouldn't infringe on free speech. My concern would be that it's extremists who actually shut down free speech. And if the government takes a purely libertarian perspective on this, then we essentially absent ourselves from intervening in this really quite serious threat.
Absolutely excellent guest. Tom Wilson, Director of Policy at the Counter Extremism Group. Fantastic. Thanks for coming in. Chris Obercourse, always superb. Now, we'll have lots more on that story later this hour, and I'll be joined by a Muslim journalist who's a member of the anti-racist organisation Don't Divide Us. That will be fascinating.